Thanks again for joining us. That's Darrell. Tonight for our fourth installment of this Balcones Canyonlands Preserves Forest Restoration training series. So we're more than halfway through, or we're just about halfway through with our series. So for those of you who are new to the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, the BCP is a more than 32,000 acre system of preserves that provides an umbrella of protection for two migratory songbirds, the endangered golden-cheeked warbler and the recently delisted but rare black-cap vireo, 6 endangered cave-dwelling invertebrates, and 27 additional species of concern. Multiple partners manage the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, with the two largest land managers being the City of Austin, which is us, we're with the City of Austin, and Travis County. And together we manage about 80% of the preserve. So by mitigating for development of endangered species habitat through the BCP, this preserve allows our region to grow and prosper in a way that protects our most sensitive species and green infrastructure. And now, that's a lot of business, but it's it. I'm gonna turn it over to Darrell. So Darrell Hutchinson, we're lucky to have Darrell with us today, is a BCP biologist. He's worked on research projects involving many different taxa in North and South America. He enjoys talking about plants, animals, and ecology. And we always really enjoy getting to see Darrell's backgrounds. Wherever Darrell has a Zoom event or is on Zoom, there's always beautiful, cool art from around the world. So Darrell, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Audrey and Kate and Jim for inviting me. Identification and removal of invasive plants. Balcones Canyonlands Preserve protects a diverse ecosystem that supports endangered birds, karst invertebrates, and many rare plants. As preserve managers, our job is to promote a healthy ash juniper oak forest community. One of our management goals is to control invasive species. I'm dividing the talk into 3 parts. The first part explains how introduced exotic species become invasive and the impact of invasive species on native ecosystems. The second part is an identification guide to some of Central Texas's most wanted invasive plants. The third part is about restoration and discovering your inner weed warrior. Although our focus is on plants, I'm going to explain the ecology of invasive species using other taxa as well. Invasive species are plants and animals that are non-native, meaning they come from somewhere else, and cause harm to native ecosystems. Most introduced plants and animals are not invasive. For example, roses and begonias are ornamentals commonly placed in gardens but do not survive in the wild. Other non-natives like dandelions or the monk parakeets flying around downtown Austin have become naturalized in our urban landscapes but don't adversely impact our natural landscapes. However, Japanese honeysuckle, feral hogs, and red imported fire ants have all disrupted native ecosystems. Only about 1% of all non-native species introductions ever become invasive. So how does an introduced species go from being an ornamental to becoming invasive? There's nothing insidious about the nature of an invasive species. Invasive plants and animals are simply adapting a common weedy growth strategy to a new environment. Weeds grow fast and reproduce rapidly. Weedy mulberry is an introduced annual that is spreading through flower beds, greenhouses, and agricultural fields. Seedlings can flower and fruit within 12 days of reaching the 2-leaf growth stage and be only 1 inch tall. The plant spreads by explosively shooting its seeds across several feet. Heavenly bamboo can spread vegetatively by root sprouting and disperse its seed to new locations by producing bright red berries that attract birds. Although the berries do contain cyanide, many bird species can digest small amounts of toxins without ill effects. Glossy privet is a fast-growing tree that outcompetes native plants for space, water, and essential nutrients. It drops copious amounts of seed, so even when the parent tree dies, the soil is saturated with its progeny. Weedy species are generally fast-growing, relatively short-lived, reproduce lots of offspring rapidly that can sometimes travel long distances. Weediness is not pejorative in this case. It simply describes a common growth and reproductive strategy. Many of our native species are weedy generalists too, like poverty weed, yellow wood sorrel, and even Virginia opossum. Virginia opossums inhabit all of Texas wherever there's water, eat a large variety of food. They produce 2 litters annually of up to 12 young, and adults rarely live beyond 2 years. Both native and non-native weedy species tend to colonize areas that are recently disturbed. The first species to establish can dominate, at least for a while. Wildfire, flooding, and tree falls are natural causes of disturbance. Wildfire reduces competition by inhibiting the establishment of woody trees and shrubs. Low-intensity ground fires increase nutrient availability on the surface, which results in a fire flush of new growth. Riparian areas are dynamic ecosystems driven by regular influx of surface runoff and soil deposition. When extreme flooding occurs, it levels the playing field to create open space and resources for fast-growing weedy species to colonize. Tree fall gaps are not very significant here because our primary forests were cut down. However, in existing old-growth forest, tree falls create huge gaps that allow sunlight to penetrate to the forest floor, stimulating seedlings to race to the canopy. Human disturbance, such as development, off-road vehicle use, and resource extraction, has sharply increased the amount of space and opportunity for weedy species to establish. As the human population increases, we can anticipate more rapid land use change, which can favor the growth of exotics even over local species. So how do exotics get imported? Introductions can be either accidental or intentional. Accidental introductions include zebra mussels and red imported fire ants, both of which are believed to have arrived in the ballast water of ships. Tiger mosquitoes arrived in a shipment of used tires. Intentional introductions include ornamental plants and even birds introduced for fun. For example, European starlings were released in Central Park, New York City in 1890 by Shakespeare enthusiasts who wanted America to have every bird mentioned by the bard. Many non-natives are introduced for food or forage. Pigs were brought here by the first Spanish explorers in the 16th century and went feral immediately. Benjamin Franklin shipped seeds of the Chinese tallow tree to Georgia for use as a source of oil. Even today, non-native bluestem grasses and bufflegrass are planted for forage. Government entities sometimes import new species for erosion control or pest management. For example, ice plant was introduced into Southern California from South Africa to stabilize slopes and now threatens many endemic species of coastal California. So why is it that some non-native weedy species remain benign while others become invasive? First, the advantage that introduced species have over native species is the absence in their new home of their native predators, parasites, diseases, and competitors. Predators, parasites, and disease play an important role in maintaining ecological balance. Released from these population controls, non-native plants and animals gain an advantage over native plants and can outcompete them for essential resources. For example, tamarisk or salt cedar is native to the Middle East and is now firmly established along watercourses throughout the southwestern US. In the Old World, 325 species of insects and mites munch on tamarisk, which effectively keeps its growth in check. One species, the so-called tamarisk beetle, was introduced here as a biocontrol and has proved to be very successful because it devours leaves at every stage. Not surprisingly, the tamarisk beetle has nowhere near the same effect on tamarisk in the Old World, because there the beetle's population is partially controlled by a parasitic wasp, which is absent here in North America. Tree of Heaven is native to China. Its roots, leaves, and trunk contain allelopathic compounds that inhibit the germination and growth of other plants around it, thus reducing competition. Our Texas live oaks also contain water-soluble tannins, water-soluble tannins that can suppress germination, but many of our native species have evolved to bypass its effects. One moment. The second advantage that introduced species have over native species is repeated introductions. For example, Glossy privet was first introduced into the US from Japan and Korea in 1794. It was widely planted as an ornamental tree and hedgerow plant. In Austin, during the 60s and 70s, it was one of the few plants available in the nurseries to landscape your garden. Over time, it established, spread like crazy, and now is very difficult to eradicate. Reaching a critical population threshold is essential to becoming invasive. Some invasive species established through multiple introductions via repurposing. King Ranch and Clayburgh bluestem grasses were originally brought in to serve as forage for cattle during drought conditions. They're not very nutritious and the cows don't care for them much. However, it grows well. So TxDOT later adopted it for a few years during the 50s and 60s and sowed it along Texas highways for erosion control. Are invasive species really that bad? Yes. A single introduction can result in native species extinction and alter the ecology of an ecosystem. Zebra mussels reached North America in the mid-1980s and rapidly became established in the Great Lakes and all the waters draining them. They are very efficient filter feeders, which means that they filter small organisms and organic particles out of the water. These phytoplankton and zooplankton form the base of the aquatic food web on which many other animals depend. Zebra mussels overrun the native mussels and starve the open water fish. Red imported fire ants arrived in Mobile, Alabama in the 1930s. Fire ants can dominate a terrestrial landscape to the point where a lizard or a mouse can rest for no more than 20 minutes at a time before the fire ants find them. Red imported fire ants spread so rapidly because of a lack of predators, parasites, and pathogens, and live at greater density than they would in their native land because of a change in social structure. Normally, the workers of two different ant colonies defend territories and behave aggressively towards one another because their queens are genetically different. However, the red imported fire ant here have formed polygene or multi-queen super colonies where all the workers recognize each other as sisters. Regionally, red imported fire ants have contributed to the decline of the ground nesting bobwhite and the Texas horned lizard. The kudzu vine was introduced from Japan and China in the early 1900s for use as erosion control and livestock feed. Free of ecological controls, kudzu blanketed entire landscapes in the southeastern US. In 2012, a sucking insect predator was discovered that effectively decreases the plant's vigor and ability to seed. Unfortunately, the so-called kudzu bug also predates on soybeans and other legumes and is now itself considered an invasive species. The European honeybee was introduced into the Americas in the 1600s and is widespread around the world. Unlike other pollinating insects, the honeybee is not selective about what flowers it will visit. Domesticated honeybees are trucked around the country and released in orchards and agricultural fields because they will indiscriminately pollinate everything from almonds and alfalfa to cucumbers and kale. So how does this threaten native bees or plants? Well, many native plants have co-evolved with a suite of specialized pollinators. Some of these pollinators are solitary bees that live as larvae and pupa much of the year underground. These specialist bees time their emergence with the flowering of their host plant and then travel miles to pollinate each and every one, which, for very rare plants, helps guarantee their successful reproduction over a broad area, even at low population density. When honeybees invade, the process is disrupted. When the solitary bee emerges and locates its host plant, it may find that nectar and pollen resources are already depleted. And since the honeybees are going from flower to flower between all the different species of plants, they may never cross-pollinate the rare plants at all. In this way, the honeybees swamp out all the specialist pollinators, sometimes driving them to extinction, and they promote the distribution of common plants over less common and scarcely distributed native plants. So, how can we control invasive species? The effective control of invasive species is a three-pronged approach. Preventative measures. Government plays a role in identifying and restricting the movement of invasive species, but their interest is in protecting industry. Aquatic species get more attention than terrestrial species. However, terrestrial invasive species that do not impact agriculture, ranching, or hunting are generally not restricted. Special interest groups play a role. For example, the nursery trade very much values plants that are fast-growing, reproduce rapidly, and are resistant to local pests and diseases. Most of the invasive plants that we control on the BCP are not included on the Texas list of noxious species. Excuse me. Vigilance. Increased trade and transport of commodities around the world is a principal driver of future spread. Border inspections are critical. Unfortunately, although APHIS, our Federal Animal and Plant Inspection Service, spends tens of millions of dollars on eradication of invasive species, their vigilance at the border is less well funded. Eradication is something we've become much better at. The challenge is to eliminate target species and prevent recolonization. Depending on where and what kind of organism you're dealing with, this can involve different methods, including biocontrols, use of chemicals, and physical removal. So now we're going to focus on locating and manually removing invasive plants commonly found on the BCP. The best way to prevent and contain invasions is early detection and rapid response. Developing identification skills is key. Let's look at Central Texas's 10 most wanted. We begin with glossy privet because it's so prevalent throughout the city and on preserve lands. I'm presenting the scientific name here, Ligustrum lucidum, because we have two species of ligustrum. One is a tree, the other is a bush. We often refer to the tree by its genus, Ligustrum, and the bush by its common name, privet, which we'll come to. Glossy privet or ligustrum is a fast-growing mid-canopy tree with opposite leaves that are two-toned, darker above and lighter below. The leaf surface is shiny, leaf margins or edges are smooth, and the tip is pointed. Since our goal is to kill invasive plants, it's important that you're accurately identifying and removing the target species. Bill Reiner and I decided to present look-alike slides to highlight the native plants that resemble invasives. My thanks to Bill for compiling a vast library of plant photos and helping me construct these plant sites. First look-alike is glossy privet and escarpment cherry. Both are mid-canopy trees with similar sized and shaped leaves. The difference is the cherry leaves are alternate and have a toothed edge. Ligustrum leaves are opposite and smooth-edged. Next is glossy privet and plateau live oak. After ash juniper, otherwise known as cedar, plateau live oak is the most common large tree on the preserve. You're not likely to confuse a mature live oak with glossy privet, but saplings and especially seedlings can look very similar. Live oak leaves are dullish, green, stiff, and usually blunted at the tip. Ligustrum leaves are shiny and almost always pointed. Glossy privet and silk tassel. Silk tassel is a small tree that superficially looks a lot like ligustrum. However, silk tassel leaves are rounded and feel fuzzy to the touch. Ligustrum leaves are pointed and feel smooth. Glossy privet and yaupon. Yopon is a small tree that is abundant in our forests. What makes these two species troublesome is that they both have smooth, pale gray bark and can grow in dense clumps. What differentiates them is the size of the leaf. If you're standing back and looking at the entire tree, the disparate leaves are obvious. The problem comes during removal efforts. When you're on your knees hewing your way through a thicket of ligustrum, it's easy to mistake yaupon for ligustrum saplings. So, Be sure to check the leaves and confirm your ID before you cut. Our next most wanted is Chinese privet. This species is also in the genus Ligustrum and the one we usually call privet. Privet is a shrub with relatively small, ovate to elliptical, rounded tip, opposite leaves. Like its cousin, privet drops copious amounts of seed that can grow into an impenetrable thicket. It's difficult to remove manually because even the smallest saplings have an extensive root system that makes them hard to yank out of the ground. And they are often multi-trunked, which makes it difficult to get the vice grip of the weed wrench around the base. If ever there was a candidate for early detection, rapid response, Chinese privet meets the criteria. Privet and elbow bush. Here's another pairing where it's not so much the leaves, but the growth structure that's similar. Elbow bush is also a multi-trunk shrub and can grow in amongst a thicket of privet. In contrast to privet, elbow bush has hairy leaves with toothed margins arranged alternately on branches that grow more or less perpendicular to the main stem, like a bent elbow. Chinese privet and Yopon. Yopon is a small tree, so structurally it more closely resembles glossy privet. However, the leaves of Yopon are small, elliptical, and rounded like Chinese privet. The difference is Yopon has alternate leaves with bumpy margins and conspicuous veins, whereas privet has opposite leaves with smooth margins. Chinaberry. Chinaberry is a large tree common in urban areas, residential suburbs, and the wildlands. Despite the name, Chinaberry has a large home range in the Old World extending from India to Australasia. Its jagged toothed leaves are pinnately compound and quite distinctive. The bark is brown and gets rougher with age. Seedlings are easy to pull and worth the effort when you're hiking through the forest. Identifying Chinaberry is not difficult, but Chinaberry and the native soapberry are both tall trees with yellow berries. Soapberry leaves are only once compound, and the leaves are entire, not toothed. Chinese pistache has only recently crossed the threshold to become invasive here in central Texas. It's a mid-sized deciduous tree that displays attractive fall colors. It enjoys full sun or partial shade and is both heat and drought tolerant. It has compound opposite leaves and buffy colored bark. Pistache closely resembles flame leaf sumac, which also grows well in disturbed native open areas. One distinguishing character between the two is the rachis, or stem of the compound leaf. In flame leaf sumac, the rachis is winged or flared, whereas in the pistache, it's straight. Bark color of pistache is light brown, while on the sumac, it's grayish. Also, pistache has a large leaf bud where the stem of the leaflet attaches to the branch. Like many plant IDs, sometimes you need to assess several characters until you become familiar with the plant. Originally from China, Tree of Heaven was first introduced to the US in 1784. It became a popular ornamental shade tree in homes, gardens, and farms because it is fast-growing and tolerant of different soil types. Its name is intended to evoke how quickly it grows towards the sky. It was adopted by the nursery trade in the 1800s and distributed by the US Department of Agriculture in the 1900s. Its popularity has since diminished due to its prolific root sprouting, weedy growth pattern, and foul odor of its stems and leaves. Tree of Heaven is not a huge problem on the BCP yet, but a species to watch out for. It has compound pinnate leaves that look a lot like Chinese pistache. Note that the ailanthus, the genus, the ailanthus leaves have a reddish stem and are slightly offset from being opposite. Taiwanese Fotinia is widespread throughout Southeast Asia and a common ornamental in China. It's a relatively easy ID. Its long, dark green leaves have a serrated margin, and its thick, bulky form is distinctive. Fotinia produces a fruit that appeals to birds, so its seed is dispersed via bird droppings. We find it mostly in the creek beds, especially on preserved lands bordering older neighborhoods. Heavenly bamboo is a marketing name. It's neither heavenly nor a bamboo. Its scientific name is Nandina domestica, so we usually call it by its genus, Nandina. The species name domestica gives you an idea about how long this plant has been associated with humans. Nandina was also introduced into the US during the 1800s as an ornamental. It's now widely found throughout the city and on the preserve, where it can dominate the forest understory. It's easily identified by its glossy, pinnately compound leaves and multiple stems that resemble bamboo. It produces white flowers and red berries that attract birds, and it also spreads by root sprouting. It's very aggressive and difficult to eradicate. If you haven't the resources to kill it, you can reduce its reproductive output by removing the flowers and fruits, but be sure to carry the seed off-site. Pruners and large plastic bags would be the tools of choice. Japanese honeysuckle was introduced from Japan through England in the 1900s for use as erosion control, deer browse, and as an ornamental. It's considered the most pervasive invasive plant in the southeastern US. It can occur in dense infestations along forest margins and right-of-ways, or climb up into the canopy to form an arbor. It persists by laying down shallow woody rootstocks and spreads mainly by rooting at vine nodes. It has opposite leaves with a short petiole that does not circle the stem. One sec. Comparing Japanese honeysuckle to our two native species. Texas white honeysuckle has a very similar flower, but its oval leaves are fused at the base. Coral honeysuckle has a very different flower, but its paired opposite leaves are similar looking to Japanese honeysuckle. The difference is coral honeysuckle has leaves that encircle the base of the stem, while Japanese honeysuckle does not. Texas hosts over 700 species of grasses, and grasses are a very important part of the ecosystem. Since range management is critical to raising livestock, most, if not all, of our invasive grasses were introduced intentionally for forage. Identifying grasses is challenging. The physiology of grasses has its own nomenclature, and identifying grasses without flower heads or spikelets is tricky. King Ranch Bluestem, often known as simply KR, is an abundant perennial bunch grass. When it flowers, the multiple spikelets cast a purplish hue. A field of flowering KR looks like many hands waving. In fall, straw-like stems appear blonde. KR's ability to dominate grassland habitats and thwart eradication efforts is legendary. Mowing and prescribed burning are two methods used to control KR on rangeland. Johnson grass can grow up to be 6 feet tall and almost always occurs in big clumps. It has a wide leaf blade with a distinctive white stripe down the center, making it one of the easier grasses to identify. Unfortunately, it's also one of the hardest to eradicate because it spreads by rhizomes, which are creeping underground rootstocks. To remove it, you need to dig up the bunch grass and the rhizomes, otherwise it will grow right back. Now on to discovering your inner weed warrior. Manually removing invasive plants is arduous work. However, it can stimulate an endorphin-induced get-your-grunt-on feeling of satisfaction, knowing that you've helped restore one tiny portion of the planet. Many hands make light work, and a small army of volunteers can make a huge impact. So how do we treat invasives on the BCP? Well, first you have to find them. A simple way to think about invasive plants is mothership trees and infestations. Motherships are the mature parent trees that produce flower, fruit, and disperse seed. Infestations are their progeny that can form first carpets of seedlings and then thickets of saplings. In terms of targeting invasives, mothership trees are the most valuable. To spot a mothership, you need to scan the canopy and learn to discriminate between tree foliage. Once you spot a mothership, confirm the ID. Then you can either cut it down or, if it's too big, girdle it. Girdling is a method of killing trees without felling them. The girdling process severs the bark and cambium in a ring extending around the trunk. If the cut is wide and deep enough, the cambium layer won't grow back. The goal is to disrupt the exchange of sugars and water flowing through the phloem and cambium in order to starve the tree. Depending on the tools at hand, there are various techniques. For example, using a handsaw, you can cut 2 parallel rings around the trunk a few inches apart, and then use a chisel to scrape away the bark and cambium. Using an axe, you can hack your way around the tree and pry out all the material between the 2 rings. You need to incise fairly deeply and remove an entire band of material. A single line of narrow cuts seldom works. There's lots of information online, but we recommend a video featuring a local weed warrior demonstrating an elegant method to girdle ligustrum. Kate will post a link. Infestations. Infestations are thickets of seedlings or saplings. Not surprisingly, they're often found near or underneath the canopy of the mothership. Small seedlings can be pulled by hand. However, different species of seedlings can look very much alike and quite different from the mature plant. Once you've confirmed the field marks, you can get onto your hands and knees and just hoover up a carpet of invasive seedlings. It can be very gratifying. Weed wrenches are designed for removing saplings. It's the ultimate tool of the weed warrior because it increases your leverage, but still requires a fair amount of exertion. They come in different sizes to accommodate young trees of different diameter. You cinch the base of the target plant in the vise, pull the weed wrench back towards you, and then yank the plant and its root ball right out of the ground. Kate will post a link to a video demonstrating the weed wrench in action. 2 problems arise when you remove plants concentrated in a dense infestation. You create soil disturbance and generate piles of debris. In terms of habitat restoration, contending with the debris is simpler. You can haul it off-site. You can stage it for mechanical chipping later. If it's seedless, you can spread it across the landscape to naturally decompose, or you can lay it in berms running horizontally across the slope to reduce erosion. However, you must not toss it into a large pile and leave it because it creates a wildfire hazard. The firefighters refer to brush piles as jackpot fuels. Dealing with soil disturbance begs the question, what comes next? Disturbed soils invite the next generation of weedy plants. Will they be natives or exotics? Well, it depends on the seed bank, but restoration efforts can affect the outcome. Repeat treatments are the first step in restoration. Weedy plants are persistent. Glossy privet and shinyberry will regrow from cut stumps. Heavenly bamboo will resprout from runners. If you clear an infestation of Chinese privet, rest assured the seed bank will be dominated by privet. Multiple removal treatments may be required. The second step in restoration is planting and seeding native species. What species goes where and when depends on site conditions and is the topic of other talks in this series. Most importantly, plant and seed native Texans, lots of them. Diversity creates stability and stable environments are more resilient. Here's a review slide that I'm not going to read. I want to thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you all on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. And I'm going back to my other screen.
Great. Thank you, Darrell.
You're welcome.
So we've got links, we've got information. We don't have any questions yet. If anyone has some questions to put in there, please go ahead. Oh, I see Sarah has a hand raised. Let me see if I can just, Sarah, are you raising your hand? I'm gonna just let you ask a question. Hey, Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if Darrell had any suggestions for renaming some of these plants like heavenly bamboo. They have such appealing names. Maybe he has something he would like to call them instead.
Pain in the neck. You know, it's the nursery industry brands these plants. So that's where a lot of it comes from. And it's tended to market the plant. So, you know, I don't have a way to do that. I think really the most effective way is to find means to lobby, in this case, the Texas legislature, to list these plants as noxious. As I said earlier, many plants, if they have any commercial potential, they are not. So for example, one of the other invasives we have around here is one of the mustards, Brassica something or other. Oh, I should know the name. But it's in the broccoli family or cauliflower family. And there probably are biocontrols to deal with this bastard cabbage. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. This cabbage plant that grows all over in, you know, highway medians and things like that. But the industry would prevent that biocontrol for fear of being introduced, for fear that it would jump into the ag fields and detrimentally affect the production of broccoli or cauliflower, things like that. So it's a very, very complicated issue. But in terms of branding, no, not really. No suggestions.
We have a question. Okay, here we go. So in the chat, Ernie says, the Chinese tallow, I know it's looking really beautiful right now. So it has such beautiful fall foliage. What's the problem that renders it an invasive species?
Tallow is not, well, it's the same problem that is with all of the invasive plant species. It smothers outcompetes and smothers the natives. It's always the problem. Chinese tallow is not that much of a problem here. I understand that it's a huge problem in eastern Texas and in other parts of the southeast U.S. And it's been introduced many times and started long ago by Benjamin Franklin, and it can be a big problem. But the issue is always the same. They smother or swamp all the natives and just rob them of resources, because they are released of ecological constraints in many instances.
Thanks, Darrell. Yeah, I've been out to Goose Island out east, and it's a lot of Chinese tallow. It's definitely different, more of a, you know, different landscape out there. So Sarah has a question: how can we lobby to have invasives added to the noxious plant list? And can you mention for anyone who doesn't know what a noxious plant list is?
So a noxious plant is, in this case, an official list of plants that can't be introduced into the country, or the state in this case. And there's an official list. And as I said, it tends to be, the ones that you're going to find on the Texas list are going to be the aquatics, like the hyacinth, salvinia, milkfoil maybe. Anyways, things that are just choking the waterways. Certainly zebra mussels would be on that list too. So what the list says is it's illegal, or only under certain conditions, to bring that plant into the state. How do you get them to change that? I'm not sure. I mean, it's, lobbying the legislature is difficult. I know the Wildflower Center has attempted to do that, so I would direct that question to somebody at the Wildflower Center who knows more about it. There's always writing letters and things like that, but I'm not sure exactly.
Good point. So we have another question. Do you recommend, I don't know if you can, Darrell, but do you recommend any chemical to kill glossy privet, e.g. ligustrum?
Well, I'm not good with the chemicals. There are lots of them. One of the ones that the staff use on the BCP is it's a tool called the it's a Lance Easy Ject, and what it is, it's a long cylinder that's loaded with cartridges of a pesticide called herbicide, excuse me, called Imprezir. And what you do is you punch the cartridges into the base of the tree, and it hopefully creates the same effect as girdling, but you're injecting in herbicide. We didn't discuss it I didn't present that in this presentation because volunteers are not permitted to use herbicides on city lands. So that's why. But Imprezir is one of them, and that Lance Easy Ject is a really, really good tool because it absolutely targets the chemical right into the base of the tree, and it has very little drift.
And I was just going to add to that too, just we're going to post, or Kate, if Kate, can you post the links to the follow-up videos? And one of those is this girdling that that Darrell already talked about, but that does have some additional benefits as a removal tool, right? To like one thing we talked about last time with tree planting is having that canopy to support a seedling. You know, you want that. The problem with the ligustrum we talked about is there's too much shade, too much canopy, too much choking out. But as it, you know, as you're girdling it, it loses its canopy and can kind of serve that too once it's not, you know, super shady. But that we'll share those videos, or Kate put those in the chat so you can check those out. Great question. So Katie asks, is invasive plant removal allowed along all trails, or do you have to be under supervision of guides?
All trails. On the BCP, it would you would need to be under guidance, certainly on any balconies, on any preserve properties. But yes, we would want to remove the invasives along the trails. If you start going into parks like Gus Frew, things like that, where it's just loaded with invasives, you really need to be under the direction of city staff, I think. So there should be a management plan for that. And you need to, of course, be extremely accurate about what plants you're removing, why, what you're going to do with them, all that sort of thing. The second video that you're going to post a link to talks about using the weed wrench on ligustrum, and the presenter talks immediately about on city property, you have to be sure that there's a management plan and a certain amount of supervision. So just willy-nilly yanking things out.
But that said, I think there's a lot of opportunity. This is Kate, if you get into invasive removal, there are so many invasive plants to remove. And so we certainly need help on the BCP, but other programs throughout the city, including through the Watershed Protection Department, they're working on those areas. The Parks and Recreation Department is working on other areas. So don't be discouraged. There's plenty of plants to pull out.
Yes, and you can also do this, at home. Convert your landscape to that and get the invasives there, or spread the word around in your immediate neighborhood. I work in my HOA and as the Firewise chair, and I'm talking about that to homeowners all the time. Gee, this is a great plant. That this one is the glossy privet and it's a real mess. And this thing is the nandina. It's a real mess. And on a home, on the scale of a single home, usually invasive species are very manageable. And yet sometimes those are the plants that the birds are carrying the seed and carrying them right into the wildland. So it's worth getting.
Great. And then we have a question about, related to that. I have been digging down 1 to 2 inches and cutting the roots of glossy privet and then tipping and pulling the tree, some as tall as 20 feet. Will that approach stand the test of time, or will the tree resurface over time?
Which privet? Chinese or glossy?
This is glossy.
Well, that should do the test of time. Yeah.
So if there's roots
But you never
left,
know how many times. I don't know what you mean. That's the thing about it. You don't really know how many times you're going to do it, but that's the way to do it. Eventually it's gone. Even the root sprouters. And the nice thing about glossy privet, it doesn't really, it'll sprout from the trunk, but it doesn't root sprout. In other words, you don't have to get the entire root ball out, probably, I think.
I've had some resprouts, but it's just tenacious and it depends. But I know, you know, when I would do some of this, we'd go back after a month or something. And even when we would girdle, we'd go back and just check to see if we missed any, you know, scraping any of the cambium off, or if there were sprouts, you know, those are out of the trunk. But if it's in your yard or something, that's easy to, you know, try that. And then it'll keep kind of going back and checking on it and removing root sprouts if, you know, or sprouts as they come up too. Okay. Is from Robert, is silky bluestem an invasive, and how can you differentiate it from silver bluestem?
Oh goodness, that's a Bill question.
I know that one a little, or I can speak to it a
Go
little bit.
for it.
It is an invasive. Silky bluestem is an invasive. It can look very similar to silver bluestem, especially from afar. But there's, for silky bluestem, there's these long dark awns, so kind of like dark threads that come over like the top of the fuzzy part, whereas with silver bluestem it doesn't have those. Silver bluestem doesn't have those dark threads, it's just fuzzy. But yeah,
Silver
so once you get
is like a really uniform color throughout the seed head.
And also, this is Jim. We don't have a lot of silky bluestem on the BCP. There's a little bit here and there, but it's mainly on the more rangeland, water quality protection lands is where the predominant population is. So that's why, Darrell, I think we just don't run across it a lot on the BCP.
Yes, exactly. I've only run across it on the water quality protection lands. So from Jonathan, which term should one use? Non-native, invasive, or introduced to classify these types of species? Also, why are there so many names? Can't there just be one umbrella term? That is something I think a lot about. What do you have to say about that, Darrell?
That is a good question. So non-native species just means they're not from here. Thousands of plants and animals are introduced that are not originally from here, and they are non-natives. Many things that are in our gardens, goldfish, things like that, do not become invasive because they never impact natural ecosystems. So non-native just means it's not from here. Invasive means it's not from here. It was introduced accidentally or intentionally, and it's impacting natural ecosystems. That.
Got it. And then I have a question. Question. Okay, if homeowners, from Sarah, would only keep their ligustrum and nandina free of berries, would that alone help?
Yes. There's actually in the nursery industry, they've developed a cultivar of heavenly bamboo, anyway, of the nandina that is sterile, and you see sterile cultivars of plants related to glossy privet as well. The issue with nandina, of course, is you could easily chop the flowers off in a yard, or the berries. It's kind of the pretty part of the plant. So for me, that would be, I'd be digging it out. But for your neighbors, they might actually like the berries and the flowers. So would it help? Yes. Would they do it? I don't know. The issue with glossy privet is it's a tree. So how do you really get all those flowers and berries off a tree? I'm not sure how you would do that safely. And it grows fast, so it can be the size of a 2-story house in 8-10 years, I'm sure, at least. And so that would be an issue.
Another issue with nandina is that the nandina berries have cyanide in them. And so when a bird like cedar waxwings gorge on nandina, which they typically do, cedar waxwings will just gorge on berries, it can kill them. So.
Right, great point. And then we have another one from Lisa. Can non-native grasses like KR or King Ranch Bluestem be shaded out?
I don't know. Possibly. I would think restoring canopy cover would really help to do that. So I'm going to say a qualified yes. I think Lisa knows the answer to that.
Does Lisa know? Does Lisa want to chime in?
Darrell gets the prize. Yes. It's the long-term version of how to deal with KR is shading it out. KR doesn't like shade. So, when we plant in areas that have a lot of KR, out at Riker is an example of that, where there's a KR field and we planted 100 and some odd trees in there. They're not shading it out yet, but eventually they will shade out the KR.
Yeah, there's the long game, and that's why we talk a lot about restoring with native species and just shifting what it is that's out there. I have a little patch of pocket prairie behind my house, and I'm planting trees in it. And whenever the KR comes up, I go out with a weed whacker and whack off all the seed heads or flower heads of the KR. But I leave all the Indian grass and the little bluestem, so they eventually creeping are starting to encroach upon the KR, getting more of the native grasses and less of the invasive KR. To eliminate it, I don't know how long that would take, but less of it is better than more of it. So restoration works that way, and there is the long game, and the long game can be very gratifying as well.
Great, thanks for that, Darrell. And speaking of the long game, we don't have many, we're gonna hopefully be bringing back our volunteer events to the public. And with those, we do some weed wrenching of ligustrum. So they're just what we're calling privet. And anyway, so that's coming that you'll be able to participate in hopefully soon. And with that, I think that's the end of our questions, and we're finishing up a little bit early, which gives you some time to check out those videos that we linked to, which is probably about 15-20 minutes of video resources. Either Darrell or Jim or anybody else on this webinar want to say anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Darrell and everybody who's helping put this series together. We're really excited about it. So thank you, Darrell. Great job.
Yes, thank you, Darrell. This is really helpful. It's great to have those side-by-sides, comparison slides and the context. So thanks so much for putting this all together for us. We'll be sharing a recording of this on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So thank you again. And I hope everybody's doing well and staying well, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you on the wildlands again soon.